Hello and welcome back to Monday Morning Detective, the podcast. I am your host, Gino Scala, and this is episode number 52. Today on the radio, I heard a broadcaster talk about serial killers as a general conversation. And he was going on and on about how life is less precious these days, that many more serial killers are out there, and they seem to be more and more each year, more violent, etc. And he was, of course, initially was talking about the Gilgo Beach, Long Island serial killer, Rex Heuermann, and he added that this particular killer has not shown any compassion and was not apologetic at all. In fact, the only recorded statement so far while he was being fingerprinted was that he asked the police if it had made the news, which indicates a level of narcissism, obviously. And one reason why the press tries not to include their name and make them household famous people, which is a part of their goal when they commit these acts. But at the same time, this broadcaster was talking about serial killers, and he obviously has never studied the crime or the socio impact of in the history of serial killers. Oh, also he indicated that serial killers were generally much brighter, much smarter than the general population. And there's no evidence to that, but we'll get into that. The term serial killer was attributed to Ted Bundy, and that's when the word was first coined. But the act of a serial killer, one person killing three or more separate people in separate incidences, goes back to really the dawn of time, and more specifically, as if we're talking about criminal history, back to the late 1900s and early 20th century with H.R. Holman. And the fact that the belief that this is a recent surge, perhaps, or rise in these types of crimes is very false. You can attribute the attention to serial killer crimes, interest in the internet, and the research that is available at our fingertips, and social media, and 24/7 television coverage with 500 plus channels. All of these are the differences of today's world as opposed to the 70s or the 60s or the 50s, etc. Now, Ted Bundy made the news. And he was headline news certainly in Florida and in the states that in which he was active, Washington, Utah, Florida, and such. He made headlines there, or at least the unknown serial killer. And yes, he was considered above average in intelligence. He did go to law school. But as a whole, he wasn't a headline newsworthy person in New York or California or Texas. He may have been buried in in this somewhere in the center of the paper, maybe an article that long, 4 Gainesville students killed or something along those lines, which is what we see today online or, otherwise. They covered the general interest stories and usually local. So in the 70s, Ted Bundy was not famous while he was on his killing spree. The headlines that you'll see in documentaries and such about Ted Bundy come from the local or state papers in which he acted. You're not going to see a headline from the New Hampshire Times on Ted Bundy, except much later on when, they interviewed him, he went to trial, a lot of gory details came out at that time, and he was convicted and ultimately electrocuted. There's a notion that serial killing as a crime is on the increase. And it's just not the case. In fact, it's much more difficult, obviously, to get away with any type of serial killing crime because of the number of cameras, the advancement in DNA and sciences, the advancement in investigation techniques. It's just implausible to believe that serial killers are on the rise. Now, what you are hearing are a lot of serial killing crimes being solved, but the crimes themselves have taken place over the course of 30, 40, or 50 years or earlier in Los Angeles. Who killed 40 prostitutes. He was doing his killing in the 80s. And DNA finally caught up with him. The Grim Sleeper, I think he was called. The Grim Sleeper. Look how quickly they got the Idaho killer. It was a matter of months. Now the Gilgo Beach serial killer, which again, the crimes were going on for 10 or 20 years, and he was still relatively active, but they were onto him over a year ago. So that's just one thing I wanted to address. The second thing I wanted to address was the intelligent or the intellectual level. You are giving serial killers way too much credit for outsmarting law enforcement. They're not doing any such thing. Richard Ramirez could barely read or write. David Berkowitz, Richard Ramirez was the Night Stalker, and David Berkowitz was Son of Sam in the 70s. Another idiot. It was police work finding a parking ticket to his vehicle in the area of one of the killings that brought down the Son of Sam. Richard Ramirez, it was a well-detailed artist conception, artist drawing, a rendering of the suspect. And it was matched to him by the public, in which time they chased him down and beat him up and held him for police. So it's not a matter of, now we have Ring doorbells, security cameras everywhere, government security on the streets, government cameras, CCTV. And again, as I stated, the advancement in DNA and forensics and things of that nature. Now, while the internet may make it seem like serial killers are in the news on a daily basis, and that's what it does, it really accentuates the attention to these, because if you have an interest in David Berkowitz, for example, you can go online and run David Berkowitz, and you will find an article on him probably as recently as last week. Somewhere in the United States, somewhere in the world, there was some sort of release, a press release, or some sort of writing about Son of Sam. A new book, a new documentary, a new movie, a new legal appeal, or something of that nature. So it's constantly in the news. But Son of Sam has been in jail for 50 years. And he will never get out. Now, yes, we do know that there are, on average, about 100 serial killers working in the United States at any one period of time. But you're probably not going to find numbers in the dozens or 20s, 30s, 40s like Juan Corona. Also in the 70s, he killed illegal immigrants, farm immigrants, and buried them on a farm. He was also a farm worker. He may have been the owner of the farm. Buried over 50 bodies. You're not going to see that anymore, except in perhaps the illegal immigrant population. It's just no way. Now, the third thing I wanted to cover was specifically about Rex Heuermann. Now, I gave the police a lot of praise for them reopening and reinvestigating and coming down with this guy a year ago, coming in with this information. We have now learned that there was information early on in the investigation from a pimp of one of the first victims, and it was never followed up on. And it was only followed up on when reopened within the last year or two. So you see, here's a situation where bad police work, poor police work, lazy, added to the scope and the size of this case. But we do know for a fact that this information was ignored and overlooked. And I hope we know more about that in the future, and I hope people pay the price. So that's what I wanted to touch on with episode 52, updates on the serial killer, especially when it comes to the Long Island serial killer. And that'll do it for this episode, and hope to talk to you again.